Lovely. Well, once again, a very warm welcome on what is yet another very warm evening, and thank you for forsaking the Mediterranean climate we seem to be experiencing in favour of being with us tonight. I'm very pleased to see a good number of you joining us. So just somebody coming in. Good. I noticed quite a few unfamiliar names. I know that Hepzibah has her own contacts, particularly in the north of England, and people who aren't perhaps familiar with the Insiders Outsiders project. So I'd like to just spend a few very brief moments explaining, if I may, what the project was and indeed still is. My name, as you can see, is Monica Bohm-Duch, and I'm the founding director of a project that I called quite carefully Insiders Outsiders, this kind of strange but often fruitful tension between belonging and not quite belonging. But it was subtitled Refugees from Nazi Europe and Their Contribution to British Culture. And it first took the form of a year-long nationwide in-person festival that really started off as a small idea in my head and really exceeded my wildest expectations. There were over 100 events in the course of the year, venues big and small, across the country, across all art forms. And it seemed to be tapping into a theme that was not only rich, but obviously seemed to be a hot topic, a relevant topic in the present, as indeed it continues to be, because one of the subtexts, one of the reasons, motivating reasons, behind the whole project was indeed to prove, I suppose that is the right word, how great a contribution all refugees can, if given the chance, make to their adopted country. So it's about the past, about a very particular generation of refugees and indeed their descendants, but also very much about the present day as well. So I'll leave it at that in terms of its wider message. So anyway, COVID struck just before, thank goodness, just before the, well, in fact, just as the festival was coming to an end, and we went online like so many people did. It was the obvious thing to do. And in a way, it was a blessing in disguise, as my wonderful father used to say, because it gave me a chance to continue with the festival in a way that was practical, not too expensive, that it gave the festival a rich and unexpectedly rich afterlife. And this event is one of many. Some of you may already have dipped into the YouTube channel, and I would urge you to do so if you haven't, of online events, slightly sporadic, but over several years now, which kind of explore further this rich topic. And I was saying to Hepzibah before we let you all in that actually looking at the lives and careers of women artists in different media has always been one of the kind of subtexts, one of the things I really wanted to be doing, to look not just at the better known figures, but also at those who have unjustly been overlooked or sidelined. So you all know the ropes. If you wouldn't mind muting for the duration of Hepzibah's presentation, we are recording the event and the recording will be available in the not too distant future. If you have questions, comments, please type them in the chat in the first instance, and we'll allow time, obviously, for that afterwards. And I think it just remains for me to say a little bit about Hepzibah herself. She's an artist and a writer. She has a very direct and personal link to the artist who she's going to be talking about, Käthe Schuftan, because her father was Eugene Halliday, an artist, a writer himself, and a psychotherapist, who was indeed a very close friend and sometimes the model of for Käthe Schuftan. She was a mere 8 years old when Katie died, and I think you made it your life's mission, or one of your life's missions, to get her back out there into the public eye. She's an extraordinary artist, as I think you will discover very soon for yourselves. Just to add that Hepzibah is also the editor of the Halliday Review and of the Melchizedek, wonderful name, Press, an independent publisher. So without further ado, and with great pleasure, Hepzibah, over to you. If you'd like to start screen sharing, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Monica. So without more ado, I think I'd better get on with my talk, which will be about 45 minutes, I should think. So here's the slideshow. Okay.
It hasn't come up yet, Hepzibah. It came up very quickly last time, didn't it?
Ah, that's because I have
just
forgotten to
try again.
There we go.
Lovely.
From the beginning.
New people joining us.
How are we now?
Excellent. All good.
Oh, somebody else coming into the...
Yes, don't worry. I'll deal with that. Don't worry about that at all.
Right.
Good.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Right, I will start. Käthe Schuftan was a remarkable artist who made a great contribution to the cultural life of Manchester in the 1940s and 1950s. I knew her as a child. She was a family friend. Käthe used to visit our house. I remember her sitting in an armchair and smoking. I was a little bit afraid of her. She seemed very fierce and intense. I was only 8 years old when she died. After she died, she was largely forgotten, apart from close friends, but I always remembered her. My journey rediscovering her began after my mother died in 2010. Sorting through her things, I found among her diaries and letters the tribute from Käthe's funeral. Until that moment, I knew next to nothing about Käthe, save my childhood memories. At Käthe's funeral in 1958, the artist Eugene Halliday had delivered Käthe's tribute at Southern Cemetery in Manchester. He spoke of her beliefs and special qualities. We all of us here know Käthe, he said, and know that she liked nothing ritualistic, nothing based on static dogma. She believed in intelligent spirit, in creative, purposive energy, which she believed ruled the living world and was equally alive in everything. She believed in creative energy, and she believed that creative energy was one with universal spirit. She has lived, and always with her art and her great energy, tried to provoke everybody else to live in the light of freedom, in the light of spirit. Reading this for the first time, it seemed to me that Eugene and Käthe were kindred spirits. The things he said about her could equally have been said about him. When she came to England, Eugene was only 27, while Käthe, who had already experienced more than enough for several lifetimes, was 40. I began to feel that she must have been an important person in his life, and I wanted to find out more. Käthe Schuftan was born on the 12th of January 1899 in Breslau, capital of Silesia, now Wrocław in Poland. She was the middle child of Jewish parents with German nationality. Her father, Dr. George Schuftan, was a food chemist with his own laboratory. Her mother was Else Nemugdan. She had a younger sister, Lottie, and an older brother, Paul Moritz, who became a research chemist. Käthe studied art in Breslau in the years following the First World War. One of her teachers was the graphic designer Hans Lestikov. Käthe's work bears some resemblance to that of Käthe Kollwitz and the representatives of the art movement Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity, such as Otto Dix and George Grosz. However, despite various influences, it was obvious to the art correspondent of one of the Breslau newspapers that Käthe was an independent personality. Her drawings and watercolors were seen as sensational and exceptional in a 1929 review. She was able to live comfortably by selling her paintings and working as a graphic artist, and she also taught. As well as pursuing her career as an artist, Käthe was politically active and was a close friend of Ernst Eckstein, a Jewish lawyer in Breslau. He was a leading member of the SPD, Social Democratic Party, and later the SAP, Socialist Workers' Party, a central Marxist political party which split off from the SPD in 1931. Together with many other prominent members of the SAP and the Communist Party, he was arrested shortly after the Nazis came to power in 1933. He was forced to help build the new concentration camp in Breslau-Dürgoi, where he was tortured and died in May 1933. After Eckstein's death, Käthe left Breslau for Berlin, where she continued his work, involving herself in underground activities of the SAP. She was arrested by the Gestapo in November 1933. She was among those detained and brutally tortured by the SA, the Storm Division, or Brown Shirts, at the former People's House in Berlin-Charlottenburg. In March 1934, Käthe was officially remanded in custody and subsequently tried by the Third Reich's People's Court, along with 23 other SAP members. She was accused of planning to overthrow the constitution by violence. Her lawyer wrote a letter pleading for her release from custody, saying, among other mitigating factors, that she never intended to overthrow the constitution. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison, minus the time she had already been on remand. She may therefore have been released by early 1936. In 2011, a memorial stele was erected for the People's House, Charlottenburg, in memory of those imprisoned there for protesting against Nazi rule. In his dedication speech, Dr. Heinrich Wörmann said that interrogations and torture of political prisoners took place mainly in the basement, and the cries of the abused could be heard on the street. Many were dreadfully ill-treated. Some communists were beaten to death, and some tried to commit suicide. Even female prisoners, such as Käthe Schuftan, were abused horribly, he said. Käthe's paintings reflected her experiences. In 1937, her work was described by the art historian Margot Reiss as expressing a primarily tragic, accusing attitude towards the world, with all its stark misery, agony, and hardship. However, this figure on horseback has a strange and ambiguous smile, considering it was painted not long after Käthe's release from prison. It is titled Narren König, the King of Fools. There are at least 3 versions of this painting, all with the same date, exploring its strange imagery. It is symbolic of the court jester who had license to criticize the ruler's behavior through humor and satire. But another painting of the same year shows great tenderness. The Nazis, Hitler in particular, disliked art that was in any way modernist. They adopted the term entartete Kunst, or degenerate art, to describe works which they identified as Jewish, communist, or simply un-German. Those artists whose work the Nazis decided were degenerate were sanctioned, forbidden to teach, exhibit, or sell their art. In December 1933, just after her arrest, Käthe's work was among that of over 25 artists shown as degenerate at the Silesian Museum of Arts in Breslau. 3 of her watercolors and a drawing were later confiscated by the Nazis from Breslau museums in 1937, as can be seen in the Entartete Kunst inventory, which is available online on the V&A Museum website. The Breslau exhibition of 1933 was a precursor of Goebbels' infamous exhibition Entartete Kunst of 1937, where the paintings were chaotically displayed, accompanied by derisive texts criticizing the art as unacceptable. Modern artists such as Picasso, Klee, and Munch were included alongside Jewish artists such as Dix, Chagall, and Schwitters. It is clear that paintings such as this would be among those confiscated. This drawing of 1937, I think, may be a self-portrait. After her release, Käthe continued to work, although to what extent is unknown. Käthe managed to leave Germany, arriving in England with her mother in June 1939. Käthe's brother was already here. Dr. Paul Schuftan had come in 1936 as the British representative of Linde Eismaschinen. In 1938, he joined British Oxygen and lived in London with his wife and mother. Käthe had to find work and became a housekeeper in Manchester. She was sponsored by her employer, Neville Rawlinson, a bank manager. He was an art lover and was more concerned that she continue her painting than wash dishes, and would say to her, "Leave the dishes, just paint." However, after the German invasion of Norway in 1940, there was an outbreak of spy fever and agitation against enemy aliens. Thousands of Germans, Austrians, and Italians were rounded up and interned, regardless of the fact that many of them were Jewish refugees who had come here to escape the Nazis. Although Käthe had been exempted from internment in 1939, Mr. Rawlinson recollected that she was among those interned on the Isle of Man. I haven't found any evidence yet for if she actually was, or for how long she may have been held there. Not long after her arrival, Käthe met Eugene Halliday. They moved in the same circles and featured in the same exhibitions. Once Käthe had her own flat, she hosted soirees with a growing following, Eugene and his friends among them. The earliest British review I have found for Käthe's work is of two portraits in the annual spring exhibition of the Manchester Academy of Fine Arts in 1940. The Manchester Guardian reviewer wrote, "As portraits, they are remarkable for their vigorous intensification of the sitter's personality. As drawings, they are clean and unhesitating. As colour, they are radiant and arresting. Many of Käthe's watercolours are on a large scale. She first drew in pencil, then painted in a translucent wash. Some of her work had subdued and muddy colours, browns and ochres, but others were bright, clear, often primary colours, blues, yellows, and red. Käthe's work was again selected for the Academy in 1941 and 42. The war years were intense, exciting, and creative, as well as stressful, terrifying, and dangerous. The Manchester Blitz of 1940 left hundreds of people dead and thousands wounded. Through all this, Käthe seems to have been working non-stop in munitions with her commercial art, holding her soirees, drawing, painting, and teaching. Early on in my research into Käthe's life, I met David Threadgold, who had a collection of Käthe's work and had been searching for information about her. We exchanged our details, and Käthe's story began to emerge. My mother, Joan, had lived next door to Käthe in Victoria Park in the mid-1940s and told me a few things about her. David Threadgold had met Richard Gardiner, who had lived in the same house as Käthe when she first came to England. Gardiner described her flat as a squalid attic room and remembered that she had a group of young friends who provided her with cigarettes. Not rationed, but often in short supply, perhaps the cigarettes were given in lieu of payment for art lessons. One of Käthe's students was José Ball, who worked for the Arts Council, a friend of Joan's. In 1945, José wrote to Joan about going to Käthe's, where she did her first life drawing of a man. This photograph of Käthe is from Joan's collection. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Josie wrote to Joan in August, "The next time I see Katie, she will eat me alive as I promised to go." The war was over. Pieces were left to be picked up. Everyone was living from hand to mouth with rationing coupons. A neighbour was trying to find a job for Katie. "I went to the drawing class last Tuesday," wrote Josie. "No good at life drawing. Katie is going to draw me a big one on Saturday night." Katie may have promised to demonstrate a full-length life drawing for her class. Josie's enthusiasm in her letter is infectious. And this photograph was given by Katie to Josie and is inscribed on the back. Katie was clearly an inspiring figure to her young friends, but she could also be intimidating. Joan remembered on one occasion Katie, short-tempered, pouring a pot of tea over the head of a red-haired man who had irritated her. "You want more? I can brew fresh," she declared. This understandably fierce aspect of Katie's character was captured in another of Eugene's portraits of her. Another of Katie's young friends was Tony Warren, the creator of Coronation Street. He gave a fictionalized portrait of her in his novel, The Lights of Manchester, as the character Magda Schiffer, combining both her benevolence to young people and fierce and straightforward manner. He described her as a woman who looked like a marmoset in pain, small and thin, with a Dutch doll haircut, sallow skin, and singeing dark brown eyes, dressed in shapeless black with amber beads, who spoke in broken and challenging English. Of a secret recipe, she declared, "I have precious little of my own, and what I have I bloody well hold on to." And the one character in the story, Magda, said, "He will never be more than art student." The family let him study textile design. They let him play at being an art student for a bit. If he'd been a good artist, they would have known. He would have been sent to London or Europe and not Salford School of Art. In October 1945, Katie's work was included in an exhibition, 7 Painters, at the Manchester Ballet Club. Käthe Schuftan, wrote the reviewer, shows a brilliant portrait drawing, but prefers to subordinate her talent to satirical comment and emotional expression. One can readily understand why the Nazis dared not leave at large such a mordantly graphic expositor of human indignity. What did the reviewer mean by this? Was he pointing out why Katie had suffered under the Nazis, or did he himself find her work distasteful despite his appreciation of her talent? Katie went on to exhibit with the Manchester Group, formed in 1946 by Margot Ingham, a Manchester artist and teacher. A talented painter, Margot had a great sense of style and organisational ability. She began to exhibit local artists in her studio in 1943 and organised exhibitions at the Ballet Club. Together with her husband, Ned Owens, she opened the Midday Studios in a basement opposite the City Art Gallery in 1946. The most well-known of the Manchester Group was L.S. Lowry. Margot's exhibitions were so successful that they were shown at the Foyle Art Gallery in London in 1948 and at the Whitechapel Gallery in 1949. In 1946, Katie and Eugene had exhibited work at the Manchester Ballet Club. Flower paintings, dancers, and children were popular themes, said the reviewer. But, as the reviewer again wrote, Käthe Schuftan's Mother with Dead Child strikes a disturbingly emotional note. The painting of Käthe shown here is undated, but may from its subject matter be the one shown in this exhibition. In September 1947, Käthe had become a British citizen. And at the end of the month, she had more work on show. 5 ill-assorted artists contribute to the exhibition at Gibbs Bookshop. A keener aesthetic emotion combined with powerful draftsmanship is to be found in the work of Käthe Schuftan, but it is often overlaid, swamped, and sometimes obscured by feelings of a less relevant character. There is no doubting the artist's passionate sincerity or her compelling urge to share her emotional experience, but her quality as an artist can in many cases be appreciated only by those who are willing to submit to an assault on their heartstrings. Most people will prefer the subdued appeal of Old Couple in Sunny Street and will fight shy of the symbolism she uses in collaboration with Eugene Halliday. Even the most squeamish will admit, however, that otherwise pleasant watercolours pale into insipidity in such company as hers. What kind of symbolism were the two artists using? Several of their listed works were portraits, but they were capable of producing images which their sitters sometimes found uncomfortable, using biblical, mythological, and mystical symbolism in their work. Käthe made many haunting images reflecting her experiences. 2 of Käthe's paintings demonstrate the psychologically unsettling effect their work could have on viewers at the exhibitions. Both show a half-smiling woman with a sinister figure whispering in her ear. This one could be Eve with the apple, the serpent hovering at her shoulder. This Harlequin and Columbine at first appears to be a happy image, but a closer look at Harlequin's sinister, outstretched hands shows a similarity with the Eve painting. However, having talked with David Threadgold and seen his collection of Käthe's work, I have come to understand that she also employed political satire. This painting appears to represent Winston Churchill in a fencing bout with possibly Heinrich Himmler, both curiously in their underwear, reflecting Churchill's "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech of June 1940. In 1948, a painting of Käthe's was included in an exhibition at the Midday Studios entitled Pub Scenes. Hers was among a group of studies of barroom types. I wonder if it was similar to this undated painting, which perhaps she could have brought with her from Berlin. Later, in 1950, Margot Ingham held an exhibition not for sale at the Midday Studios, comprising pieces from her private collection. It included 3 by Käthe. One of them was a portrait of Margot, which I would love to see if it ever surfaces. From the local newspapers, it appeared that during the early 1940s, there had been a determination to keep the creative spirit going despite the pressures of war. In the catalogue for this 1950 exhibition, Margot wrote of the importance of individuals and organisations buying the work of local, lesser-known artists to support them in their work. Many of the Manchester group had to supplement their income in various ways. Lowry was a rent collector, Margot herself a teacher. In the late 1940s, Käthe befriended the sculptor John Milne, then in his teens. and had a lasting influence on him. In his book on Milne, the art critic Joseph Paul Houdin gave a moving description of Käthe, who, he said, had a pure heart and a strong critical mind. She was a victim of Nazi persecution, and although she had suffered a great deal, and in spite of being a strongly emotional person, she felt no resentment when she remembered, after having escaped to England, the beatings she had gone through. What impressed John Milne most strongly was when he heard that after having been tortured, she could sit with her tormentors and discuss the beauties of Paul Klee or other aspects of art. Houdin's appreciation of Käthe's character was echoed by her employer, Mr. Rawlinson. He had asked Käthe why there was a difference between her earlier works and her post-war work. She had replied, "That was a different era, a different life." In 1948, Käthe's work headlined in a local newspaper review, "Surrealist Art in Latest Stockport Display." Anyone visiting the exhibition of paintings by 5 Manchester artists now being held in Stockport War Memorial Art Gallery would first be impressed by the striking differences in style. These pictures can easily be divided into 3 distinct groups: the modernistic, the surrealistic, and the naturalistic. Eugene Halliday and Käthe Schuftan are responsible for the surrealistic section. A feature of most of these paintings is the soft blending of the colours, giving the idea that they are scenes from a dream. The subjects seem pervaded by a feeling of misery. All of Käthe Schuftan's paintings contain grotesque and clumsy figures depicting the ugliness of the human form rather than its grace. Many of the subjects, too, are miserable, such as the head of a martyr and mother with dead child. Each picture conveys the sense of the title in an unreal way. The strange mixture of colours, though perhaps not unpleasing to the eye, cannot fail to impress the onlooker, something of what was in the mind of the artist when she was painting. 4 of the paintings in the exhibition were done by Käthe Schuftan and Eugene Halliday together, and the combination produces a most unnatural result. Most outstanding is the terrifying and grotesque portrayal of hatred in black, green, and red, enough to give any child nightmares. For all their weirdness, these pictures are fascinating to the layman. They may not be considered great art, nor may they be the type of picture that would improve the walls in a home, but they attract interest and compel a certain amount of thought. Among Eugene's friends were refugees and ex-servicemen suffering from what we would now call PTSD. By working together with Käthe on paintings such as Hatred, he would have helped her towards assimilation of her painful experiences under the Nazis. Later, he became a psychotherapist and taught art therapy. But their relationship was by no means one-sided. They became close friends, influencing each other's art and thought. Earlier, we saw Eugene's portrait drawings of Käthe and himself. Here are Käthe's portrait paintings of herself and him. And as I'll just note, as well as knowing Margot Ingham and many of the artists of the Manchester scene, they also knew Andras Kalman, who had opened a small Manchester art gallery in 1949 before he moved to London, opening the Crane Kalman Gallery in 1957. Käthe's first one-person show was held in 1951 in Prestbury, Cheshire. Margot Ingham had lost her studio premises and may have been exploring other venues to promote the members of the Manchester group. This exhibition was reviewed in the Manchester Guardian. Most of the work done in Germany in the 30s reflects grimly that decade and the artist's experience of it, notably the harrowing self-portrait and The Witness, the violent, bitter portrayal of a man who testified against her at her trial. Later work shows a confusing diversity of styles, and the unassimilated influence of Blake lies heavily on 3 of her most recent paintings: Creation of Light, Creation of Matter, and Birth of Man. Human Being, an earlier study in a similar manner, is more satisfying. Miss Schuftan achieves a variety of unusually dramatic effects in her watercolours, but the raw power which informs many of the paintings sounds too strident and personal a note, at its most aggressive in the rather hysterical Hatred. This threatening figure could be an example of Käthe's Blakean style, and it reflects the energy which we already saw earlier in that painting, Hatred, though it is a little more subdued. Strangely, to me, though many of Käthe's paintings are full of suffering, I find it hard to see the intensity of hatred in most of them. Many of the faces appear to be old rather than angry. Sometimes I find it hard to see if an expression is meant to be threatening or benign but worn by experience. There is a kind of suspension in the faces, a lack of tension. By 1953, Käthe had moved house again to Granville Road in Fallowfield. One of her young acquaintances, who visited her there a couple of times, remembered that she was a remarkable woman and her bedsit was chaotic. This is Käthe in the later 1950s. Ever since her arrival in Manchester, Käthe had worked for her living, as well as continuing with her own paintings. As a commercial artist, she produced work quite unlike her introspective and expressive personal work. She made repeat textile designs. She illustrated storybooks and designed greetings cards. Yet even here, the old familiar, sinister figures sometimes appeared. She also made paper cuts. This was for Margot Ingham's Not for Sale exhibition. In 1954, Salford City Art Gallery held an exhibition entitled I Know What I Like, of pictures from private collections. Käthe's pencil drawing Dance in a Munich Cellar was lent by Ned Owens. Sorry, I don't have that one. He described it as a fine example of German graphic work of the 1920 to 30 period. Käthe's second one-person show was at Gibbs Bookshop in Manchester in 1955. The Guardian reviewer wrote, Käthe Schuftan has been in this country some time. One remembers her as an artistic refugee, a concentration camp survivor with talent enough to take her work to a Nazi decadent art exhibition. It was then powerful, distinguished, and socially pointed. Her current show presents a lesser artist, the careful maker of esoteric trifles, not strong, certainly not distinguished. Here and there, as in self-portrait or manager, something of a former penetration is close at hand. One feels her talent to be distorted, not lost, and wishes it straight again. It is sad to think that the reviewer saw Käthe's later work as that of a lesser artist, but this may be related to a new factor, her encroaching illness. Käthe had been through terrible experiences, and she was a chain smoker. In 1955, she painted this woman in blue and green, flanked by two sad clowns. David Threadgold interprets it to mean that she received her diagnosis of cancer around that time. By 1958, she had become so ill that she had to move into a nursing home. Tony Warren must have been in contact with her at this stage of her life, for he wrote a most poignant scene for his character, Magda Schiffer, in his novel. She saw a figure who could have been one of Lowry's new paintings of tramps and grotesques come to life. A woman in an ankle-length black coat with a black cloche hat pulled down over a greyish-yellow face was walking slowly along the edge of the pavement. It was Magda Schiffer, the painter who was supposed never to leave her attic in Victoria Park. This is the first time I have ever taken a taxi. I have been a servant in England when I first came. Oh yes, I have emptied my fair share of chamber pots, but I have never had a servant in your country. The German government have finally settled my compensation, so I am splashing out. Where are you living? She asked. Christie's Hospital. Yes, I have crabs. Sounds even nastier and more invasive in German, doesn't it? They work miracles at Christie's, she said. In this case, they can do nothing. I have become a fiend to their morphine. I insisted on this taxi ride. How I shouted! They were glad to let me go out for the afternoon. Let me tell you that. I have a very short time to live. Käthe died in February 1958. She was only 59. A very short time before her death, she had received a sum of money in reparation from the German government. Halliday wrote, sadly, of the fact that having received a compensation for her uprooting and her sufferings, Käthe Schuftan died a few weeks later, prematurely but unbroken. Käthe's friends were devastated. Halliday described how John Milne used to draw while listening to music, and that he made one particular drawing while listening to Bach to release his sorrow after Käthe's death. Eugene wrote to her mother, "Neither of us at that time realized how little value her good fortune was to prove to her. I cannot think over again how close Käthe came to the happiness which security and freedom to work would have given her without feeling sick at heart." Margot Ingham wrote Käthe's obituary for the Manchester Guardian. Her technique as a painter in watercolour was superb, and this, combined with her fiercely independent creative spirit, made her a unique figure among the artists of the north of England. Eugene gave the tribute at her funeral. She has lived, and always with her art and her great energy tried to provoke everybody else to live in the light of freedom, in the light of spirit. And if therefore we could have a way of remembering her, let us always remember her as a prophetess of spirit and of freedom. In philosophy, she had perhaps one love, one idea that she loved most, And that was the idea expressed in Jacob Boehmer's Theosophy, the idea of the firecrack, the Feuerschlag. This, for her, meant the outbreak of spirit from the dominion of matter. She looked forward to that more than anything. In all the years we ever discussed together, she had one idea dominant in her mind, and that idea was the ultimate freeing of herself from the bondage that she felt to be vested in the material world. She has now escaped from this into the spirit, the freedom that she has always loved. Following her death, he arranged a one-person retrospective exhibition at Salford Art Gallery. In June, he wrote to let her mother know of the exhibition and that there had been notice on the radio and TV. He also explained why Käthe's work had not always been well received. You may know that German art is not very popular in England. Käthe herself well knew this and had her own views on the subject. In any case, it often takes time for real appreciation to grow. Käthe's dominant idea is always to provoke thought about fundamental issues of freedom and humanity, and I much regret to say that people in general have little desire to face any serious problem of life. Nowadays in England, pictures are most appreciated if they are completely void of significance, standing only as pleasant stimuli to the eye and not provoking too much thought. Käthe remained always the more sure that her pictures must say something of life value. Selling power was the last thing she aimed at. For her, a picture was the vehicle of her idea. Without an idea, she considered it superfluous to paint. The Manchester Guardian reviewer explained clearly why Käthe's work was difficult to appreciate. And she made it clear why we should make the time to do so. Käthe Schuftan once said of her years in and out of concentration camps that in the end she understood and almost sympathized with her torturers. Only a German could meet so levelly the scorn of the Nazi party, searing public disgrace, the breakup of family, the destruction of paintings, poisonous imprisonment. But there is no hatred in the little retrospective show of watercolours at the Salford City Gallery this month, only a deep bitterness. Some would be shocked by their lack of religion, by the repeated vision of God as a master puppeteer, by their muted agony. But hers was an innately gentle expressionism, in which forced indignity stands close to nobility, and where the one blind beer cellar orgy flouts itself as patently ridiculous. Perhaps any art inseparable from hostile political climate is difficult to grasp, for its power comes from unpleasant overtones which we instinctively fear. To be moved is to identify ourselves with an abnormality we cannot understand, too remote now to meet with an honest, humble pity. That Käthe Schuftan was an eloquent watercolourist is beyond dispute. That a gesture of reparation for her suffering should be made when the debt was long ago inexpiable is an irony she would have shrugged away. It hardly matters now whether we like this painting or not, or indeed whether it is good or bad. What matters is that we remember Käthe Schuftan and understand. Eugene cleared Katie's room after her death and stored her books, drawings, paintings, and other effects for her brother, Dr. Schuftan. Katie's mother died a year later, aged 85. Dr. Schuftan remained a consultant with British Oxygen until just before his death in 1980. Sadly, following her death, Katie seems to have been almost completely forgotten, save for the memories of her surviving friends and mentions in 3 books about the sculptor John Milne. However, in the early 1990s, some portfolios of her work reappeared and were sold to the Ginnell Gallery in Manchester. A number of these paintings were subsequently acquired by David Threadgold. His subsequent inquiries over 20 years and my discovery of Katie's funeral tribute have led to this rediscovery of the story of her life.
Thank you so much, Hepzibah. That was wonderful, so interesting, so moving, and what an amazing artist. I mean, goodness, goodness. Okay, fine. There are 1 or 2 questions coming in. Let me just hold on, let's go to a different view so we can see everybody, hopefully. Good. Where to start? All right, let me check, and now is everybody's chance to type in what they might want to ask or comment on. Okay, so should we start with some quite, sort of factual questions from Wendy Levy, who's obviously intrigued by Käthe, quite understandably. How long did Käthe work for Neville Rawlinson, and did they remain in contact when she left his employ?
I'm afraid I don't
Have you any?
know how long she worked. There's so much I don't know about Katie. I'm just amazed at how much I have been able to find. I don't know how long, but I would imagine that she would have kept in touch with him and some of his friends as well, such as Richard Gardner, whose portrait painting I showed among the slides. But I would think they kept in contact. That's my feeling.
She was obviously very lucky because, as many of you will know, sort of one way that female, mostly Jewish, not always, but mostly Jewish refugees could actually come to the safety of England was to find employment as domestic servants. And for many of them, these were middle-class women who back there had servants of their own and, were totally unused to the kind of work that was being offered to them, but it was their exit to safety. But one hears really rather awful stories, or certainly not encouraging stories like the one you're telling of somebody who understood her artistic ambitions and actually continue, can encourage her to continue. So that's was obviously a major plus in her extraordinary story. Yeah, yeah. What about the internment experience? You say that she was obviously exempt, as most people were at the beginning of the war, but then in the early summer of 1940, when Winston Churchill famously said, "Collar the lot," irrespective of the fact that we're mostly Jewish refugees, and it was women as well as men. You're saying that you think she was interned, but you have no evidence or information about that yet?
Yeah, certainly from the people that David Threadgold had spoken to, he thinks that she was interned. I saw Liz had a hand up there. Do you know
Liz,
more about
do you want to add something
Friday?
there?
Yeah, my mum, Josie Ball, knew Katie, and I learned from my mother that Katie had been interned in the Isle of Man.
So she was interned.
There was mention of it.
You don't know how long for?
No idea.
No.
It was rarely very long, although there were exceptions, and the women were kept quite separate in the very, very pretty south of the island. It was much less camp-like, although it was still essentially a situation of imprisonment, but they were, they had greater freedom of movement within the 2 adjacent villages in the rather picturesque south of the island. You could find out more, Hepzibah, and I know you want to take all this further. There's somebody I can put you in touch with called Yvonne Cresswell, who used to be the curator of social history at the Manx National Museum, and she's been terribly helpful to many descendants, for people who wanted to find out about internees. So I'm very happy. I'll do that with great pleasure, and I'm willing to bet.
Yeah, what I can add to that is that Eugene also spent a lot of time on the Isle of Man. He used to stay with a friend in Port St Mary.
Yes, that was
Port St Mary and Port Erin where in the south of the island where the women and children internees were. So they could have been communicating with each other there as well as in Manchester. So I couldn't even say whether he met her on the Isle of Man or in Manchester, but they were certainly in the same place at the same time.
Interesting. Tell us more about your father. He was obviously a very interesting man. Where was he born? Tell us a little bit more about the family background. Was it a European family or British born?
He was from Manchester.
Yeah.
His parents were music hall artists.
Oh,
Yeah, so his father was a musician, and he also worked in music hall and in circus. He could turn somersaults while playing the violin without missing a note.
Wonderful.
And his mother was a singer, a dancer, and an actress. So he had a very creative background. So he was trained in music, and then he went into art in his teens.
Really interesting.
And from there, he went on to develop this ability to work with people who had very difficult experiences. And he became a lecturer and also what you might call a spiritual teacher, as well as a psychotherapist. And he founded two organizations which still exist. One is the International Hermeneutic Society, which was based in Liverpool, and another one, the Institute for the Study of Hierological Values, which we still continue under the name Eugene Halliday Association. So there are websites for those. And his legacy has continued since then. He died in 1987, but his legacy is still very much alive, and there are about 15 of his books in publication, which are available. So
and you're planning, is it a joint biography of?
Well, this work on Käthe has arisen out of the biography of him that I'm writing, but she sort of took me over at one point for at least a year. And I found I was writing about her, so
I'm not surprised.
Quite an experience, yes.
Indeed. I'm looking, we're a fairly small select group here, and if you'd like to simply put up a virtual hand, or in fact actually just put up your hand if you'd like to sort of talk rather than type something in. But yes, in the meantime, there's some interesting things coming in from Ruth, is it Utting Lawson? I believe that Käthe began work in a Jewish refugee hostel in Heaton Road in 1940. She was a cook in the hostel, but was apparently not very good. That bears out what I was saying about these women probably having had, sort of cooks of their own, but certainly weren't used to this kind of work. Her father, hold on. My father and uncle, who were both in the hostel, remember her burning the cocoa regularly. Ruth, do you know each other? Have you met each other before?
We have, yes.
Yeah. Okay, fine. Okay, good. I thought maybe that was a sort of unexpected connection. Alan Mann is quite rightly saying that Rachel Pistol, who's very much an expert on internment, British internment camps, could help. But I think actually Yvonne Cresswell, in terms of actually getting documentation relating to her time in the Isle of Man, might be the person to start first. There are questions about where you can see her work, but perhaps before we come to that, I mean, it struck me, and I'm an art historian by training, and when I give a lecture generally about the emigre visual artists who came to this country, one of the points I always make is that the very Northern European, essentially Germanic expressionist idiom that they brought with them was hugely alien to most, not just the general public, but actually even to those in the British art world. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. One is to do, and I guess we mustn't forget that, the First World War, the sort of anti-Germanic feeling in the 1930s, even before the outbreak of the war, was still there. There's a kind of resistance to actually accepting anything that was German as somehow something one could, be sympathetic to. National character, who knows, muted understatement. There's a wonderful quotation by somebody called Harry Weinberger, who came from Berlin originally, and indeed employed an expressionist idiom much less anguish than Käthe's work, but who actually once said, I think in the 1960s, that, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but, the way I wore my heart on my sleeve, and I was struck, you used some lovely, an assault on the heartstrings, I think you said, perhaps about one point, or disturbingly emotional, tragic, accusing, all these things that one associates with expressionism in art were completely alien to what he called the tendency to British muted understatement. And one doesn't like to generalize about national characteristics, but I think there was a real sense of this being an alien way of making images, as I think you borne out by the comments that you cited. There was, just following on from that, there was an extraordinary riposte, as it were, to the notorious 1937 Entartete art exhibition that toured Germany in 1938. About a year later, in the New Burlington Galleries in London's West End, there was an exhibition which was going to be called Band Art, and then they decided at a time of appeasement to kind of just tone down the political angle and simply call it 20th century German art, which was designed in effect as a riposte to the Nazi position that any art that wasn't naturalistic and anodyne or indeed propagandistic was degenerate, to be reviled and indeed destroyed. You don't know of any connection, and her work would have fitted the bill perfectly. Haven't come across any evidence that she was involved or included in that show. I don't suppose so. No. Interesting. And there was a remarkably appalling, actually, comment by Raymond Mortimer, who was a very well-known critic of the day, writing for the New Statesman, so reputable, not a kind of way off piece sort of comment. But he said that these are so ugly, the works on display, that I can and we know that Hitler decried them as being ugly, called them degenerate, and it's the only good thing I've ever heard about Hitler. Incredible. Yeah, exactly. It makes gives me goose pimples every time I say that, and that's that. Yeah, so I think her art fits absolutely into this extraordinarily powerful expressionist sort of trend, if you like, sort of strand, which was for many people certainly in the 30s, and indeed I would say in the post-war period as well, quite alien and difficult to come to terms with, but how powerful it is. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, more things coming in. Let's just have a look. Right, a nice message from David Warren saying that he needs to leave. Is he related to is it
I do know him, yes.
Yes, indeed.
David.
Fine. What happened to any of her confiscated work? Yes, you showed a few early works from 1936, I think. And did you touch on the fact that she was able to bring over a few works?
Yes.
When she came, do you know anything about that?
Well, some of the paintings that I have seen clearly must have come with her, and some of the, although I think there are a few inconsistencies in some of the mentions of her in books. Sometimes dates are wrong, and sometimes details are not quite right. She was not included in Goebbels' exhibition Entartete Kunst, but she was included in Breslau, where work was confiscated. So little details like that. It's not a little detail, but certainly she was, because of the date of some of the paintings that have survived and are here, then they clearly had been brought with her from Germany because they're dated before she came here. Yes. It would be lovely to see what she painted before the war, or before the Nazis actually came to power, her really early works.
Indeed, it would.
Have you
put out feelers in Germany, in Breslau at all? I know it's now Wroclaw, but in sort of the archives there.
I've looked at some online archives.
Right, because that might be worth pursuing as well.
I've certainly had some help from Joachim, who is here. Thank you so much for your help on the German side of Käthe's story. And I have found some of her work in that V&A archive inventory, which is available online.
That's an amazing resource, isn't it? Absolutely.
But also online, if you do search for it, you can find film of the Goebbels Entartete Kunst exhibition, with showing people walking around looking at this exhibition and how badly things are deliberately hung and how banal it all looks. And everybody's just wandering around looking like ordinary people looking at this work and being disgusted by it. It's quite a horrifying
Well, not being disgusted
feature
by it. I mean,
film.
there were more people who attended, vastly more people who went to the so-called, the Degenerate Art Exhibition than to its kind of propagandist counterpart, which was called the Great German Art Exhibition in Munich, 1937. And, we'll never know because people weren't allowed to say what they thought. But, many of them
Yeah.
maybe went to say goodbye to the work they actually much admired. I mean, this is, it's a really interesting, bigger topic. I mean, yeah, I mustn't hog the story, but I mean, an obvious question from, again, I think from Wendy, in what museums or art galleries can Käthe's work be found? Is it currently mostly in private hands?
Yes, it
Yes,
is. Yes.
yes. But tell us about your plans for the future, because clearly this is a figure who really warrants much more serious and widespread attention. You are seeking to find work. Tell us what you have in mind.
Right. Well, we have an exhibition coming up in Manchester at the Long Street Methodist Church, the Arts and Crafts Church in Middleton, in September. I'll send you the link for their website with the details on, and you can perhaps send it out to
Good. I
people who
will
are
have to.
interested.
Sure.
This is with Anthony Cosgrove, who he and David Threadgold both have collections of Käthe's work, which very kindly they have let me look at and photograph, for which I am most grateful. And they are amazing. As you've seen, what I've been showing you today is a small selection of her works. So there's going to be a small exhibition of hers in September in Middleton. We're going to meet people at the Jewish Museum in Manchester early next month to discuss possible exhibition there. And I know Anthony has other connections with other art galleries, so I'm hoping that we will be able to put on more exhibitions and get her more widely known. And I'm also planning a small publication of this story based on what I've been telling you today, and illustrated with some of her paintings. So I want to get that into publication and be available as well.
Absolutely. And obviously, the Manchester connections are strong, but she deserves to be more widely known. It would be nice to think that there could be an exhibition
Yes, she
somewhere
does.
else, if not London, but yeah. Wonderful. I also have in mind, actually, as you talk, there's a Manchester filmmaker I'm in touch with who actually initiated something called the Worth Mills Project, apropos internment, which was a notorious, still not well enough known aspect of the whole internment story. And he's always on the lookout for interesting material. We'll talk about it later, but who knows? I think I really do believe she deserves much better to know. And so that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Hepzibah. Any last chance to ask any questions or have your say before we wind things up? No? All right, lovely. So there were quite a few more people signed up who haven't actually appeared tonight, as often happens, particularly on a summer's evening, but the recording will be available. So those of you who are here, do spread the word. You go to the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. It'll be uploaded there within the week, if not sooner. More thanks coming in. If you'd like to know about our future activities, do go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website. And if you scroll down to the bottom right of any page, the home page would be fine. And you can just sign up very quickly to be on our mailing list. But in the meantime, actually, you might be interested to know that this is part of a cluster of events that I timed especially to coincide with UK Refugee Week, which strictly speaking was last week, but why not spill over a little bit, which ties in with what I was saying earlier about the kind of past and present relevance of the broader topic. But on Thursday, we have a talk, which again, actually, it's actually more centrally focused on the internment story. It's by a young man called Hugo Max, whose work, both in film and an artist's book, engages with his great-grandfather's story. So this is an extraordinary example of a fourth-generation artist engaging with these complicated and fascinating family histories. So that's on Thursday at 6 o'clock. And then on Monday, something rather different, which just, again, shows the range of material that we're sort of including in the Insiders Outsiders project, is going to be essentially a book launch for a new publication on Glyndebourne the quintessentially English phenomenon, the opera house in the heart of the Sussex countryside. But who knows, who knew that actually it wouldn't have happened? Some of you are nodding, perhaps you already know that it would never have come into existence had it not been for the serendipitous coming together of a rich English aristocrat who loved opera, and not one, but actually several musical talents from Europe who ended up working with him and for him. An extraordinary story. So if you're interested in opera, if you're interested in this notion of quintessential Englishness, but perhaps not quite, then do join us on Monday evening as well. Lovely. Last chance? No. Okay. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Hepzibah, that was so interesting. Thank you so much. And I look forward to keeping in touch and seeing how your work sort of continues and progresses. I'm sure it will. Lovely. Good. Thank you so much, everyone, and all the very best. Yes, a big thank you. Bye. Good night.